Hello, everybody. Whoa. Got to do a check on the volume. That's Prosod, Toronto, Canada, Canadian artist playing the sitar. This is CKDU 88.1 FM in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. Online at ckdu.ca. You're listening to Non-Duality Talk. I'm Jerry Katz. It's July 16th, 2014. We are live on the air. My guests today are Mark Scorelle and Jeff Cox. Hi, gentlemen. Are you there?
Yes. Hi.
I can't tell. Okay. Mark, can you say something?
Yeah, sure. Hi. How are you?
Okay, Jeff.
Yes. Hi. Hi.
Are you sure you're two different guys?
Well, this is the show, non-duality.
It's non-duality. This is perfect. They're actually one person. Where are you located?
Well, right now we're in Trumansburg, New York, but we're based around Ithaca, New York, home of Cornell University, et cetera.
Okay.
Let me. Finger Lakes area.
Let me tell.
We're about to have a grassroots festival just down the street.
Oh, really? Is that going on now, or?
It starts tomorrow.
Oh, good. Well. 4
days of music and, the grassroots style.
Okay, and this is Jeff, right?
Yes.
Okay. I'm getting there. Mark
Yep.
Scorelle and Jeff. I'm just going to do a little bit of introduction stuff. Mark Scorelle and Jeff Cox are editors of the book we're going to talk about today, called "The Short Path to Enlightenment: Instructions for Immediate Awakening" by Paul Brunton. They edited the book, and I've read the book. It's beautiful. It's very fresh. It's like it could have been written yesterday or written today. And this book has been endorsed by Adyashanti and Gangaji. And we're going to talk about Mark's and Jeff's personal journeys to non-duality briefly, and mostly about the book. We'll talk about the long path and the short path to enlightenment and exercises and other topics related to that. Let me introduce Jeff Cox. Jeff Cox was president of Snowline Publications for nearly 30 years. And I bet a lot of listeners have one of those books on their shelf. Snowline specialized in books by the Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism. Snowline is now a part of Shambhala Publications, which is headquartered a few blocks from here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Since retiring, Jeff enjoys volunteering for the Paul Brunton Philosophic Foundation and sharing more time with his wife and partner, Christy. So welcome, Jeff Cox.
Thanks, too, Jerry.
Mark, are you ready for your thing? For your big moment?
Okay.
For your close-up? Mark Scorelle. I met Mark in Halifax a couple of weeks ago and visiting our non-duality satsang group and contributed beautifully to it. Mark came to non-dual teachings through Eckhart Tolle in 2002, and Mark edited the book Advaita, The Truth of Non-Duality by V. Subramania Iyer, and of course edited the book we're going to talk about today. Mark's also written some articles, such as The Cosmic Vision. So welcome, Mark Scorelle.
Thank you.
Again, I welcomed you a couple of weeks ago in Halifax. And links to everything I'm talking about, I'll let you talk in a minute, okay? Let me just finish my thing here. Links to everything I'm talking about may be found at nonduality.org if you just scroll down a little bit. So, okay, are we ready to go?
Sure.
And I start every show with an invitation to define non-duality, since we may have listeners who've never even heard of the term. Who wants to go for it first? Mark, do you want to go first? And
sure.
Go ahead.
Well, usually when somebody asks me for a definition of non-duality, I refer them to your website, because you have a page with a lot of definitions. So I'd like to go with a kind of experiential definition. Like the first, most basic realization of non-duality is called no-self, or the realization of emptiness. So in that realization, you come to know that you are this sort of empty, aware space, the subject of your experience, rather than the ego, or a bunch of thoughts and a social persona and emotional complexes. So how this reflects on the definition of non-duality is that once that aware space is, you recognize that you are that aware space, then it kind of collapses the me versus the world kind of emotional, intellectual tension that's, built up through life, through feedback and conditioning and your experience. So that's one, aspect of non-duality. Another realization that's what you call a non-dual realization is oneness, or I think it's phrased, the world is an illusion, Brahman alone is real, the world is Brahman. So the realization is that the world is Brahman, it's shining through everything, everything is God, everything is self, everything is you. So that reflects on, this is kind of a different approach to non-duality because it's oneness with everything, no separation, and I would say that's aspect number 2. I don't really have a conclusion on that one yet.
No, well, I'm sure that'll be unpacked, unfolded as we just continue the conversation. Whatever direction we go, I'm sure we'll somehow be unpacking that. Jeff Cox, would you like to give your definition of non-duality now that Mark's covered it all?
Sure, Jerry.
Thank you.
By the way, Jerry, I have a little bit of trouble hearing you. I don't know if it's how it's coming across on the radio, but I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. I'll talk. Is this better?
So, I like to, when one examines how experience arises, one can come to a conclusion that what we are engaged in is a situation where we have mind or knowing mind and its thoughts or experiences. So it's like mind and its thoughts. And thoughts here, I don't mean to restrict the term to concepts, but any contents of consciousness, such as feelings, impulses, sensations, perception, intuition, imagination. Really, we want to encompass both the subjective and objective poles of experience. One thing that we come to is that the dream analogy is actually a good example, because when we're dreaming, there appears to be a subject and, say, other people in the dream and objects, just like in waking experience. And the objects appear to be outside of you, just like in waking experience. But upon awakening, you see that there was really only one dreaming mind that presented the whole scenario to itself. And so you have that mind and the cognitions that occurred, which are the dreams, or the appearances of that mind. And for somebody, maybe even before they become a quester, let's call it, they might have one of these cognitions might be the thought, oh, I'm dreaming. You might actually have a lucid dream. And so it becomes the case that the process of cognizing a dream could include an awareness of that which is having the dream or knowing the dream, which is beyond the person who appears in the dream. And I would say that our waking situation is very much like that. I find, as I've studied some non-dual teachings, that the epistemological process is somewhat left out. Sometimes it's still said that there's an object and then there's like vibrations go into your eyes and into your brain and then you have a cognition. Well, the training I've had in trying to understand non-duality, I'd say that kind of understanding of how experience arises just it's not non-dual. You must have one substance, which we have, call it mind, and the appearances within that mind.
Thank you.
So I turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you both. I'd like to next ask you each briefly to tell us a few milestones in your journey to non-dual understanding, and I know there's some overlap in your backgrounds, actually. And I
Yes,
believe
well
I believe this will just help the listener get to know you a little better. Jeff, do you want to continue and go over a few milestones, and we'll ask Mark.
Yes, I don't know. You know, I'm 66, right? So I've been fortunate to have a number of milestones. We each entered the path in our own way. For me, it was during college that I discovered meditation, yoga, spirituality, and I had the good fortune to find a group near where I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, that studied Paul Brunton's teachings and also Asian tradition primarily, also some Jungian psychology. And through my association with them, I became more and more interested. Also, as I began meditating, at some point a light went on in me, and I realized that this was the love of my life. The pursuit of, I guess you could call it truth, but I probably would have framed it at that time as the pursuit of God or the divine, and I still do oftentimes think in that way. I met Anthony Damiani, who's Mark and I both shared him as a teacher for many years. I met him in I guess it was in the late 60s, and he came to Columbus, Ohio in response to students there writing to Paul Brunton and asking for help. And Paul Brunton actually sent Anthony to us in Ohio to answer questions, to help us focus our studies. And after I graduated from college, I had a number of lifestyle choices that I wanted to explore, but the one I ended up with was to move to Ithaca and study with Anthony and try to begin my life here, my post-school, and now I'm on my own. Come to Ithaca, find a job, settle into the community here. And Anthony had a bookstore in Ithaca called the American Brahmin Bookstore, where a lot of students from Cornell actually found it and ended up staying. Mark and I think both went to the American Brahmin Bookstore and participated in classes. Probably Mark was there before I was. And eventually we built a center out on Lake Seneca called Wisdom's Goldenrod, and the classes moved to there. And Anthony was a taskmaster in a way. I studied with him from 1971 till he died in 1984. I think Mark started before then. And we would have classes just about every night of the week on different topics. There'd be a night on Buddhism, a night on Jungian psychology, a night on Plotinus, the Greek philosopher, and Hindu studies. And also we read Paul Brunton's books. And he was very much interested in finding the truth that underlays all the great traditions of the world, and also how the different approaches complement and help us to understand the truth that they're trying to express. Well, I lived at Wisdom's Goldenrod for 5 years. I was interested in a monastic lifestyle, and I did that fairly intensely for about 5 years. And then the summer of 78, it was 77, I guess, Paul Brunton actually came to Ithaca and met with individuals here, gave interviews one at a time or in little groups. And at that time, I decided to stop living at the center in this monastic style, and I actually had been working with the person that I ended up marrying. Her name is Christy, and began a different kind of lifestyle with her. In 1979, the Dalai Lama came to Ithaca at the request of one of the Goldenrod students, and he spent some time out by our center and opened us up, many of us, to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And that was, for me, followed some years later by the opportunity to work with his publishing company that was called Snow Lion and was very much a startup. There were a number of people involved. My business partner, Sidney Pyburn, my wife, Christy, were involved, and some other people were involved. And we slowly grew the company as Tibetan Buddhism moved to the West more and more. It gave me an opportunity to meet many teachers and authors and to attend teachings of the Dalai Lama in various places around the world and spend time with him. He's always been a great inspiration. And over the years, my wife and I have pursued other teachers and traditions, and in addition to Tibetan Buddhism, I probably was more involved in Tibetan tradition than my wife was, but we were both very interested in the Dalai Lama as a human being and the wisdom that he has to offer. Most recently, I've been inspired by the teachings of Adyashanti and find him rather broad in his approach and able to address many topics, and I particularly enjoy the way he's able to work with people. Our company was acquired by Shambhala 2 years ago, and I retired, and the Paul Brunton Foundation has been in existence since the mid-'80s. I mean, Paul Brunton died in 1981, and he left his legacy, his literary legacy, to his son, and his son came to Ithaca and worked with Anthony and some other people to go through PB's unpublished material and to bring it to publication.
And that's what will be.
Notebooks of Paul Brunton were published just between 1984 and 1988 by Larson Publications.
And Jeff, excuse me, that's what we're all going to be. That's what we're going to be getting into. And I do want to ask you both,
Yes.
who Paul Brunton was, and exactly. We'll get more into that. And it sounds like you had a rich life with studying with Anthony Damiani and the Dalai Lama, and
Yes.
yeah, very rich. I'd like to move on and ask Mark about some of his milestones. Jeff, is there anything else you want to finish up with?
No, I think, listening to Mark will be, our lives have overlapped in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I know there's some overlap. I'm going to ask Mark, and then we're going to go into Paul Brunton and then right into your book. So, Mark, do you want to cover a few milestones in your journey to wherever?
Sure. Well, I can pretty much say ditto with being involved with American Brahmin Bookstore and Anthony Damiani. I was never a monk. I was always, had to work in the world, which is good. And then I think that after Paul Brunton died and Anthony died, a couple of years apart there, the notebooks came out, and I would just read them on the bus to work every day. So I read them a couple times, and then I got interested in shamanism in the 90s, was the going thing, and I did a few things with that, and this guy, this friend of mine, called me up one day and said, "You got to check out this guy, Eckhart Tolle, he's big now." So I noticed he was at Omega doing a 5-day retreat, so I went, and that was sort of like the beginning of my involvement with the non-dual teaching. And so I decided to check out as many teachers as I could and read as many books and see as many videos, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that do that too. And finally I had 2006, I went to a retreat with Adyashanti and had a major, awakening kind of experience, and I've sort of been, that's furthered me on this journey, I would say. Outside of, I've always had spiritual experiences along the way, but I think it would be too long to describe to put them in here. But about once every 2 or 3 years, have some major glimpse or revelation or something like that. But that was important like that.
Well, this show is going to be extended beyond the usual hour. It's going to be extended an additional 90 minutes. So, Mark, if you're, I think Jeff has to run after the hour, but Mark, I think you might stick around a while, so who knows what we'll get into. I'd like to next talk about your book and Paul Brunton. The book, again, is The Short Path to Enlightenment, Instructions for Immediate Awakening by Paul Brunton. And if people go to nonduality.org, all the links are there. So who was Paul Brunton? Jeff, let's go back to you. I mentioned you volunteer for the Paul Brunton Philosophic Foundation. Well, you mentioned that yourself. And just introduce us to Paul Brunton, and why should we be interested in someone who wrote his popular books back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s?
So who is Paul Brunton? Well, you can read some of it, obviously, on the paulbrunton.org website of the biography and so on. He was a person who was born in the late 1800s. He was one of these spiritual explorers, I guess, would be the best way to describe him. Although he, from an early age, and during his life in London, he from an early age had some major mystical openings. So that when he went to India in the early 30s and eventually met Ramana Maharshi and Shankaracharya and other people that you can read about in his book, Search and Secret India, he was already much more knowledgeable in these matters and experienced in these matters than he portrayed in the book. He was writing a book for Westerners who had had no exposure to the East, and he himself wanted to pose as someone who was also, exploring, trying to find out, trying to, be skeptical, be rational in his approach to these matters. Between 1934 or something like around there and 1952, he wrote 10 or 11 books, depending on how you count. And each of them, I would say, are relevant today. Many of them are the basic spiritual path that one can practice, either what we call long path, short path, a combination thereof. There are a number of them. I really don't think they're out of date. And I know, for instance, we've been studying them, and you said the book read as a fresh book to you, and that's encouraging. I think it is a timeless wisdom that has been reintroduced and revisioned by Paul Brunton. He certainly had many teachers in the East, not Ramana was a significant one, but he had others. And his own explorations in Western occultism and philosophy, and he had his own inner guidance and intuitive faculties that quite highly developed. And most of what he writes, or I would probably venture to say all of what he writes about, he's had experience of. He's not reporting, like when we put the short path together, we're putting together his teaching. And I would say that I have certainly not had everything that's described in this book by any means in terms of my own experience, so I'm benefiting by Paul Brunton's wisdom and experience. So I would say he revisioned the traditional philosophies of the East and West for this modern time. And probably far into the future will the notebooks of Paul Brunton and these early books be a benefit to students that want to pursue the vast range of spiritual topics that he covers.
I think the quality of his writing, of those books written so many years ago, is better than probably anyone. You can mention Alan Watts, Eckhart Tolle in these days, or Adyashanti. He probably was better than all of them put together in a literary sense.
Yes, he really worked as a writer. He wanted to be a good writer and a good communicator. That was a skill that he honed till the end. He loved to find the perfect pen that would just be comfortable in his hand, and maybe his intuitive nature could just use it, would just flow out of the ink. He was constantly writing, teaching. These notebooks, like the Short Path book, is full of individual paras on various topics. Each one was an inspiration, written down on whatever he had at hand. A piece of scrap paper, a gum wrapper, something more formal, whatever. He would describe it as he would go sit in the silence and wait for the inner, the inner voice, the inner intuition, the insight, whatever to come through.
He was a tremendous force and a writer, and he introduced Ramana Maharshi to the world. Let's go to Mark Scorelle. Can you give us your introduction to Brunton and
Sure.
maybe tell us something about Larson Publications, because they figure pretty big in the world of Paul Brunton. You know what? Maybe can you also talk about, we touched on that with Jeff about reading some of Brunton's original books, and then his notebooks kind of may be a little bit different than his popular books. Maybe you can talk about how they differ. You got all that?
Yes, I think I have all of it. I don't know. For us, Paul Brunton was Anthony's teacher, and so he was always the teacher behind the teacher, and so he was a sort of a charismatic figure.
That was Anthony Damiani.
Yeah.
Yeah, Anthony Damiani's teacher. Yeah, go ahead.
Anthony Damiani's teacher, right?
Yep.
And so people would go visit him and come back with these teachings and reports and opinions and all kinds of interesting stuff. So it kept us, salivating for more. And let me see. Once his posthumous material came, we got to research a little more. Like I found 1,250 pages of direct teachings of V. Subramania Iyer, bound in a couple of volumes in Paul Brunton's posthumous material. And I researched that for like 4 years. It was amazing material. And, we just put together different aspects of his life. Like he was peripherally involved with the Golden Dawn group in England, which was a magical society. And there was a guy there named Ananda Metya who wrote a number of the rituals of the Golden Dawn, but also later went to Ceylon, I think, and became a Buddhist monk and came back and started the British, Buddhist society that eventually Alan Watts would get involved with. So he had all these, interesting, quirky, things that keep coming out about him that I always found interesting. And let's see, what else did the notebooks were, I read all the books, we studied them in the classes, and they were helpful. I mean, you can't imagine how ignorant I was coming out of college. I had no knowledge of any of these Eastern teachings or spiritual teachings. So, we learned about different samadhis and different types of meditation and diet and health, and it was really an intense education course.
Mm-hmm.
And the notebooks were, I really like them because they seem to, especially the ones in the short test, seem to directly address some experiences I had that I couldn't really understand in the context of the other books. And so I had read them a couple times, the books a couple times, then started this email list, Wisdom L, and started putting out a Brunton quote a day. And then I started focusing on what were the short path quotes. And then I would bring in supplemental material from what was happening with Eckhart Tolle, Adyashanti, the other non-dual teachers that were, coming to the forefront in the 90s and the 2000, and so that sort of was my education. I mean, by doing that, I became, transformed or changed or educated by it.
And it led to the publication of this book, The Short Path to Enlightenment, which we should get into because we're at the top of the hour already. We only have about 20 minutes, so we have to talk about. The title of the book is The Short Path to Enlightenment. So what's the long path? And Mark, you can go ahead and continue. Tell us about what the long path is, and maybe
Sure.
I can ask Jeff to then talk about the short path.
All right. Well, the long path is the progressive path. It's the path of, improving yourself, making yourself worthy. I know for me it was, I want to be on this spiritual quest, but I'm not worthy. I've got to improve myself. I've got to become educated. I have to think clearer. I have to change my diet. I have to meditate every day. I have to, learn these different arts, like we learned astrology and Jungian psychology and dream analysis, and all of this seemed to be a part of what it meant to be on the spiritual quest, or meant to be worthy of self-realization. Like you had to improve yourself to be granted realization, let's say. And so, but the long path is it's focused on the ego and improving the ego. Like you have certain complexes you want to work out, you go to a therapist, whatever. So it's depressing in a way, because, I don't know, but after 30 years on the long path, I really didn't feel that much improvement. My psychology was basically the same. And so I think part of there's different transitions from the long path to the short path. Some people can run them simultaneously. But for me it was, I'm just not interested in this anymore. And in doing these practices, I'm not interested in these disciplines. I've heard it all. And so at that point, became the opportunity for the transition to the short path, which is what sort of happened with me.
Yeah, I guess the long path is defined by an end, perhaps. Maybe not necessarily, but at least a transition to a short path. And Jeff, can you talk about the short path?
Sure. So, picking up where Mark left off, at some point, there's always new challenges that arise on the long path, and new development of a personality that is called to happen. You're called upon to deal with this situation or that situation, whether it's an internal situation or a relationship situation or anything like that. And it begins to look like, Mark was saying, like it goes on forever. And actually, there is no end, in our view, to the evolution of the personality. But there is a shift of identity. And the short path is all about that shift of identity. At some point, you get to some point, whether it's like frustration or a grace, a moment of insight, a meditation that wakes you up or shows you something about the ego that you're so paying so much attention to cultivating, is actually not who you are. P.B. describes it as a vortex of thought, an empty kind of a swirling of thoughts, emotions, everything you can think of as, you can just look at what normally goes on inside in terms of all the concerns and in your life, and try to find a self in that. And you can have the experience of it being a vortex of thought with no self in it. It's actually other than you. And what is that other than you? It's other than your awareness, which is primarily what you are. So the short path that P.B. introduced to us, which can be found in other traditions under different names, but I like P.B.'s approach. It's basically to recognize and attend to your own, what we could call higher self, or in his language, the over-self, that's present here and now. And not only is it present here and now, but some of the thoughts and feelings and activities and impulses that we have are sourced more from the over-self, let's say, than from our fears and anxieties and concerns for our own bodily and social survival. So you begin to recognize, when you recognize the over-self as being who you are, you also, the personality first becomes in relationship to it. And he describes that as a process of remembering the over-self. As you go through your day, remember who you really are and what is the source of your actual creativity, experiences of love and peace and things like that. It's not that your ego is the source of peace. The ego is not, it's definitely not peaceful. So you begin to say, oh, wait a minute, the overself's been here all along. It's just under the guise, the ego's claimed ownership of everything that I thought, was me. It's like the ego's saying that that's me. But you start to recognize, no, there's something screwy going on around here, and you want to figure it out. So the short path teachings can straighten that whole process out very quickly by showing you who you are and how to come in alignment with that. First, DD says through remembrance. First, DD says through remembrance, and then secondly through actually claiming your divine identity in an as-if kind of exercise, which is to invoke and offer yourself to the overself in an act of surrender, which happens whenever the grace so moves.
That term, the overself, is very typical of Paul Brunton. I don't know anyone else who has used it, at least in writing. I like a couple of nice passages from your book. Maybe I'll just read them if you don't mind, as they read so nicely. Paul Brunton writes, and you've selected these writings, Mark and Jeff, while the long path man is busy worrying about the evil in himself and in the world, the short path man is busy smiling at the good in the overself and in the world idea. That's pretty concise and shows the difference between the long and the short path. And another passage, Paul Brunton writes, there is no wish in the short path for man to be better than he is, no desire to improve his character or to purify his mind, no sense of being obliged to rectify the distortions brought about by the ego in both thought and feeling. And of course, this is what you were saying, but just trying to show that difference between the long path and the short path.
Right, there's a nice quote that he has where he says it's a 180-degree turnaround.
Yeah, I saw that. Don't know where it is now.
On the horizontal, sort of.
Yeah, where did I see that? So this book consists of these short, concise passages. There can be several on a page. Some are longer. But Adyashanti said, read this book as you would a scripture or a sutra. And it's true. It's just very concise, meaningful, holistic writings that are fresh. They might have been written back when he was writing his notebooks, probably in the 60s and 70s, but it's like they were written today or spoken today. So
I agree.
Yeah, and you chose the right passages. I mean, you chose passages that convey that.
Principal one.
Yeah.
Mark did most of the choosing, and I did most of the arranging with the help of others, including my wife, Christy. But Mark did a lot of the mining work here, and we looked at the whole thing several times. We added a few more in, we removed a few, we focused it more in topics, and came up with the short path as it stands. I would say it's a representative collection of teachings from the notebooks of Paul Brunton on the short path. And there you may find some other gems in the notebooks that we missed, but then anyway, you found the other ones. They're undoubtedly some more, but I think
Oh, it's all
very
over.
representative of what PB has to say about long path and short path.
Let's just to be practical and experiential. I mean, let's focus. Keep looking at some examples of short path exercises. I lost track of who I'm on. That was just Jeff. Maybe Mark
Okay.
can talk about.
Yeah, I could give you a story.
Yeah, go ahead.
When I was reading the short path stuff in the notebooks, I would find that I had a problem, sort of a psychological problem, where I'd become spontaneously angry at this person who had passed on, one of my teachers. And throughout the day, like 2 or 3 times a day, I would just be totally lost in this anger. So what I decided to do was attach a short path exercise, remembrance of the overself, and use the anger as like an alarm clock. And so I did that for about 6 months. Every time the anger would come up, I would go remember some experience that I could associate with the overself. I think the experience I had was one of sort of compassion for the human race or something like that. And then I had went to England, to London, on a tourist thing, and I was at the Tower of London, and I just spontaneously had this experience of this teacher as the higher self. I could just see this person was it was this total feeling experience, and it lasted for about 45 minutes. And all I would do is I would just look inside, and there would be this blissful, intimate feeling with this person sort of being representing the overself. So then the anger issue seriously reduced after that. But it was a sort of a practical application of one of the short path exercises.
That's great. PB makes the point that when grace starts to descend, when the overself begins to make itself felt and recognized, there's a certain amount of house clearing that still has to go on. And I think I don't know if Mark would agree, but it seems to me like those areas of the psyche need to be surrendered and understood and surrendered and seen through. And when worked on in that way, it actually brings us closer to who we are.
Right. If you have some anger in the psyche, if you have a complex, it creates a dualism in your system, so you can't really have a complete realization without resolving those complexes.
Mark offered it up in remembrance. What a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm. A couple of terms that are mentioned, the over-self and grace. And another term that's used is mentalism, which sounds like a word from the 30s or 40s. But you have a chapter entitled Mentalism as the Key to Non-Duality. Can we talk about that?
Sure.
I don't know who's there. Jeff? Is that Jeff?
So this is Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff Cox.
It really, he wants to say that you can understand this, and it's experience. If you look at experience, you'll come to mentalism, if you really look at it fresh. But the point is that there's not an outside thing of which you form an interior idea. Yes, there's a perception of an object, and you have judgment, concepts, and whatever about it. But the point is the perception of the object is itself a mental act. And in the dream analogy that I mentioned earlier, that's really our situation. We're inside of a cosmic dream. We have a common world, and that is served to us through the divine mind, or in Vedanta it's called Ishvara. We have a common world, but each of us is like a ray of that sun of the divine, the world mind, PB calls it. We call it Ishvara. Each of us is like a ray of that, and our experience is within that ray. So we share a common world, but we each have an individual development, and that individual development is something to be honored. So I don't know, does that helped here with this idea of mentalism. It's really that there's not the so-called material world, even scientifically, has become less and less material. And he's just pointing philosophically to that right away and saying, but it's not something outside of experience. It's like, I guess some scientists are saying it's all within consciousness. So it's pointing at the same kind of understanding.
Mm-hmm. The book says
so
that.
What does it do? It undermines dualism. You know, if we realize that we're just basically working with cognition, it also allows us to transform it more easily. Because if you change the way you think, it will change the way you experience, or you will attract experiences that accord with the attitudinal shifts that you're going through.
And
My read on it's a little different, but I'll just throw it in.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Which is that I know that Brunton was studying with Ayer when he came up with the teaching of mentalism. So I think that mentalism is a kind of scientific adaptation of the basic Advaita analysis of experience being insubstantial, or the mind introjects a certain substantiality into the world and objectivity, but it's really an inversion of the permanency of the self. So that once that's withdrawn, one sees the world as a kind of substanceless image. And then, that's a basic step on the path. I mean, on the Advaita path, which is the world is an illusion, Brahman is real. The world is Brahman. This is the world is an illusion. Brahman is real. Part of it. Or, you could say, there is a mountain, there is no mountain, there is a mountain again from Zen tradition.
So I would agree. I think that what Mark's saying is that the degree to which you think there's an outside material world is a measure of the degree to which you're clinging to the subjective soul of experience, the degree to which you believe in your own ego. And when you withdraw the identification with the ego to the basic mind, or self in Advaita, you recognize that the world and the personality, let's call it, take on a very different kind of reality.
We have about not even 5 minutes. We could probably go a little longer because I'm doing the next show as well, so I don't have to worry too much about the transition. So bearing on what you're both saying, there's a quote that was sent to me from you, and it goes, it is all like a gigantic dream with every human inserting his own private dream inside the public one. And this is a key sentence here. A double spell has to be broken before reality can be glimpsed. And the spell which the world lays upon us and that which the self lays upon us. That sounds pretty tricky. And what you were just talking about, I think maybe we can transition into that particular quote and elaborate on that. If one of you wants to get into that, Mark.
Well, I'll say a few words, I guess, since I hope Mark will continue and people will have a chance to benefit from.
Yeah, you go ahead, Jeff.
The individual dream is it refers in a way to the psychology that we bring to our experience. What's sometimes referred to as our story. And, we're advised to not get caught up in our story, as it were. And the whole realm of psychological projection and withdrawal of projection and new projections, et cetera. This is kind of like the overlay that we put on the world that is offered to us. And one can, in Buddhism often they make a distinction between freeing oneself of the obstructions to liberation, they call them. And what they mean is liberation from the afflictive emotions and the belief in the personality as self, or let's say selfness, in any experienced thing, whether it's a personality or an object. So that part is the removal of the personal illusion that we contribute to experience. But once you wake up to the witness self, which is the pure, spacious knowing, it's like the limit of subjectivity. There's still a world that appears to that knowing consciousness. And it's, even though you might know that it's the same as the consciousness itself, it's still felt as other and presented. As, is somehow not the same as you in some way. And Mark alluded to it earlier in the movement to the sense of oneness with everything. That the ultimate, when you remove the illusion of the world, it's to recognize that mind alone is, and that then you would recognize yourself now has really become the whole world of experience. And I think this is the basis for compassionate action, for instance, the way the Dalai Lama has so brilliantly offered the world. To really recognize all beings as one self.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the oneness realization is more of a feeling type of realization that everything is divine, every being is sacred, and you really find that you can harbor no malice or harm others. It's sort of an innate, it's just part of that realization. And
Yeah. I just want to, when people hearing this again will sense this and know this to one degree or another. But it makes me want to go back to methods again, exercises bearing on the short path. And one of them that was pretty cool, I think, Mark, you mentioned it very briefly, is the as-if method. Let's just get practical again in the last couple of minutes here. Well, what do you think of that? Or can you just describe that? That as-if identity exercise.
I used to think that exercise is pretty dualistic, actually, because you imagine some experience or recall some experience where you felt you saw there was no self, or you felt the presence of the overself or something like that. But since I've been more involved with the non-dual teachings, I realized that the realization that they're pointing to is simply a change of perspective, which is always available. I mean, all you have to do is, once you've been introduced to it, is just remember that this is what you are. So the as-if exercise gets way easier. I mean, you're actually doing it quite naturally throughout the day. You're preoccupied with something, you get involved with something, you interact, and then, you're back into the base position, which is awareness, or simply being who you are. So that was my little...
Let's talk more about that in the second hour, and maybe Jeff, let's give you the last couple of minutes here. What about some of the... we talk about a sage, what a sage is, and qualities of a sage, because sagehood then would be the great fruit of this short path.
It is the fruit of the short path. I mean, the sage is no longer it's not about an exercise anymore. It's more like the personality now is fully surrendered. The personality becomes an instrument for the overself to express directly into the world through creativity, intuitive direction. That Phoebe talks a lot about intuitive action, intuitive feeling, and intuitive wisdom. that you are acting from within. You have the inner stillness. You know that mind is the reality. And you allow that reality to move you. You're not acting for the personality. The personality has become the vehicle now, after long and short path evolution, to be able to express the divine that's always been present in us. Being a sage, I mean, your grocer could be a sage. It doesn't mean guru, which means, maybe the thing about Paul Brunton was he kind of withdrew from the public eye after he stopped with his public books in the 50s. And he really wanted the emphasis to be on the teachings and not on himself. He remained private. Even with Anthony, who Mark mentioned was his student, P.B. was asked about Anthony being his student. He said, well, Anthony read my books. He asked me questions. I answered them. But what he realized on his own. So being a sage is really being in alignment with your own higher self and having your personality matured and developed enough that it can express the